Welcome to Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. I'm Ron Scholl. Last time on Gas, as the techs considered how to tackle the remaining 60,000 pounds of liquid chlorine in Car 3, health officials tried to allay residents' growing concerns about their health. We now continue with Part 1, Chapter 17, Complaints. Hodges felt growing dread as people returned from the exclusion zone. When husband Mark Hansen visited home, retrieved items had all this white stuff on it, she said. Talk had surfaced about a white powder or dust coating surfaces. He said, "It's all over the house, just like it's fallen down." White dust covered everything. Ominously, Hansen told her, "It smells like pesticides out there." Emerald told him to air the house out, but he said, "The smell's everywhere." Hodges wondered, how do you air out Alberton? Kathy Finneman of Alberton took part in the second pet possession retrieval on Sunday, April 14. "I got sick when I came home," she said, "so I was only here for 15 minutes at most. My eyes were burning again, my lungs hurt, my lips were burning, my tongue was burning." She felt nauseous. The smell was real strong in the house. "Weed and feed," she said. She regretted her visit. "I think my eyes were a lot worse because of that." Finneman didn't recall any offer of air monitoring. When the Wheelers of Alberton visited, Wilma recalled, "We shouldn't have come." "It was rank," Tom said. "You could smell it all over town." The re-exposure made Wilma's eyes water. They saw no monitoring conducted. A thin grayish-white powder coated some furniture and house plants. All their doorknobs were rusted. Their bedding and couch stunk. Their trees, like many in town, had reddish-brown needles. They'd left behind a small dog that hid under the porch and left more food and water. He had his eyes running, his nose, kind of asthmatic symptoms, Tom said. The dog died soon after general re-entry. Randy Augustine visited Alberton within the first week. "I was in the house for half an hour and suffered a violent headache afterwards," he said. His migraine lasted 36 hours, along with fatigue. "The smell outside was like a fertilizer smell or a pesticide smell," he said, "a little different inside the house. A strange-looking whitish-gray dust coated interior surfaces." Sandy Halbert's husband Don made a possession retrieval in Alberton. When he came up over the 9-mile hill, he said the smell hit him and it made him nauseous, she recalled. That's when he really started getting sick and having asthma. Don told her the smell at the house was a chemical fertilizer smell. The tropical fish were dead, as were aquarium fish at the cafe where she worked. Eleanor and Norman Brovold of Alberton evacuated to the house of their son up West Mountain Creek. During Eleanor's stay in the exclusion zone, the smell changed. As the days went on, she said, there was a smell in the air like fertilizer, like when you do your lawn. Brovold only smelled this new smell when I would come down into Alberton, surreptitiously. Richard Swartz was the pastor of the Alberton Community Church. His first exposure came when I came in on a Sunday to get some animals, he recalled. April 14. Schwartz's experience was unique. "Well, I was in the hot zone for 19 hours in getting those animals." His odyssey began when he arrived late in Frenchtown for an animal rescue meeting, so I decided to go on ahead, alone, he said. Schwartz drove on the frontage road, but found Alberton blocked off, so he drove up a mountain road until he hit snow. "I hiked behind Alberton," he said, "and came down into Dave and Ann Stenberg's ranch, north of I-90, across from the spill, which is the hot zone. During his descent," Schwartz said, "I could tell I hit the chlorine because it was like a big pocket. It was like an invisible cloud. On the edge, he could even back out of it. He figured he was around 300 to 500 feet above the canyon floor and could smell it all the way down to the low-lying ranch." Schwartz thought the gas pocket was at least 1,000 feet wide as he moved west. "I hit that, and so I covered my mouth up with my handkerchief because it was too strong. When he hiked up West Mountain Creek to the Wilson home, he left the gas behind." Schwartz spent the night there. The only symptom Schwartz had was burning eyes. On the fourth day of the spill, Schwartz observed something no monitoring had discerned, the three-dimensional shape of an ongoing chlorine release. When Hansen mentioned to Hodges that it smells like pesticides out there, the smell's everywhere, her heart dropped. "That's when I really got that sense of dread," Hodges recalled. And the next day, Newt Tochi got up at the meeting and said he'd been in there, and he said, "Why does it smell like pesticides?" He said, "I really have a bad headache from being in there." They shut him right down, and they said, "There is no smell out there. There was never an acknowledgement of the smell. Never. That was taboo. I wondered, what's going on here? Because I knew these people, Newt and Mark. They're not going to be making something up. As Ellen Leahy had noted, then edited, cause of Alberton smell, can smell. A later ATSDR survey asked of people allowed home for brief visits during the evacuation whether they experienced symptoms during the visits. Half of the visitors, 155 people, reported feeling ill. Among the wide range of symptoms, burning sensation in the eyes and throat, cough, shortness of breath, painful breathing, nausea, rashes, and other led the list. Most residents eligible to return home on April 14 chose to stay out. Some of those who returned reported more exposures. Dixie Robertson recalled about a week after Southside reopened, the first time we came home, Justin, who was 10, walked in the door and he couldn't breathe. Her son had an asthma attack, necessitating a rescue inhaler. Her family returned to their motel until after general reentry. The Stiles family of Southside Road visited April 14, and every one of us got sick, Jay said. We got out of the car and we looked around. It just stunk. There were no birds. Their concrete driveway had turned snow white. Stiles suspected the moist weather turned the pockets of gas he had seen on April 11 into concentrated clouds of hydrochloric acid. We just all felt nauseated. Let's get out of here. I built this house with my bare hands. I didn't care if it burned down at that time. There was something bad there. It wasn't a chlorine smell. I don't know what it was. Catherine DeNude of Roscoe Road was a friend of Kim Garst. A few days after the spill, she accompanied Garst on a possession retrieval. So we went to Kim's first, down on the Ponderosa. Garst was a stickler for a neat yard, and her visiting sister's kids had left toys strewn about. She jumps out and she starts picking stuff up out of the yard, DeNude said. And she kept looking over at me and yelling, "Oh my God, it smells so awful out here." It smelled like fertilizer or something. But she was saying, "Well, I'm worried about Wesley Mayo. He's just 2 years old. He's going to be picking all this stuff up." DeNude found the same smell at a Roscoe Road property. A horrible fertilizer odor, she said. DeNude equated a fertilizer smell with weed and feed. Her Douglas firs had dropped their needles. The next day, she said, Kim was sick. I took her to the press conference room. We had to take plastic bags. That girl puked for the next 7 days. She finally went to the doctor. We all had diarrhea, too. Ponderosa 1 smelled chlorine on April 11, but a week later, the area smelled very different. I think I called the health department, she said, and I reported that it smelled like pesticide to me. The person I talked to said, well, it must be that somebody was spraying. I said, I've lived there for 15 years. I've never smelled anything like this. No one has ever sprayed around here. Don't you think it's a little much of a coincidence that somebody has sprayed, especially when we've all been evacuated? That just doesn't make sense. No one investigated her complaint. Steve Adams and family lived at the far northeast corner of Ponderosa Acres, near Eddie's Underpass. Upon visiting after April 14, Adams decided to stay out until general reentry. When I saw what was left of my dog, he said, I didn't think it was a good idea to go back. He had been there the whole time. His eyeballs were swelled shut. His eyes were infected. His ears were infected. Lori Adams said the dog had burned skin around his eyes and smelled like the air on the morning of the spill, something unidentifiable and toxic. An unidentified man speaking up at one public meeting said he lived 3 miles east of Alberton and was allowed to return home April 14. 2 nights later, he said, we had the hazmat monitors up there and they were monitoring over 1 point, whatever the heck it was. I'm just saying that gas went over that hill and sat, and every night it did the same thing. I'd go in and complain, and they'd say, well, we've got the monitors out, and they're not finding anything. These exposures caused sore throats. They all let us come back, he said, and we sat there and argued with them that there was still chlorine in this area. John and Carol Greenwood lived about a mile up Petty Creek Road and returned on April 14. John said, I feel that we should not have, because in the morning when you walked down through the pasture to go down to feed, you would go through spots that had a real chemical smell. One particular area, I would have to say, had like a creosote smell almost, Carol said. John recalled, about 10 days after the spill, we had Rollet Prine from Prine Vet Clinic in, checking horses. Walking down through the pasture, I stopped and said, Rollet, can you smell that? He said, yep, I don't know what it is, but I sure in the world can smell something. He had us there to try and track the horses to see if there was any lung damage to them, Carol said. And we couldn't even physically do it. And his comment at that point was, the horses look like they are okay, but it looks like to me you guys need to be put down. I know there are some folks that are very unhappy with him because they did feel that their animals had long-term health problems. About a week after the spill, John opened the door to a walk-in cooler, and it was just loaded with chlorine gas, Carol said. It just hit you like a club, John said. Carol said neighbors were trying to get rabbits up from underneath the crawl space of their house, and she got her lungs burned pretty bad trying to get those out because that's where the chlorine and whatever else it was mixed with was. Even areas temporarily evacuated April 11 as a precaution or never officially evacuated had residents wary of returning. Charlotte Ringlob and family lived in Huson and didn't attempt to return until April 14. Boy, a lot of us couldn't stand it, she said. I no more than hit the Frenchtown Valley than my nose started bleeding again. The Ringlobs ultimately stayed out about 5 weeks. We tried to come back 4 different times, she said, before we finally made it. We would just end up sick. The Lundells lived a mile up the 6 Mile Valley and self-evacuated, staying out until April 14. When you come back, you smelled it, and then you lived in the smell and just got accustomed to it, Dan said. Joyce found a white powder, like if somebody took and sprinkled, really lightly, flour. It was kind of all over. The dust was heavier outside. Within a week or two, about a dozen other houseplants wilted and died. Evergreens outside turned brown or lost needles. To the west, the belatedly evacuated residents of Sawmill Gulch were allowed visits to take care of animals left behind. Diane Roberts smelled chlorine during visits and thought her symptoms were aggravated. At first we were coming in daily, she said, but Roberts had reservations. I thought, how stupid, we shouldn't even be out here. After a week of this, one man, who she thought worked for MRL, became livid. He was very angry, and he just said, how could they have done this? Sent you guys out there to feed your animals. What in the hell is wrong with those people? The man told Roberts, don't ever go there again. They can come in and feed your animals. And so we didn't do that any longer. Sear Resident 1 visited home about a week after the spill. The smell was strong, she said. You could smell it. It was the chlorine smell. Residents weren't the only ones complaining. Some personnel tasked to work in or near the exclusion zone received exposures despite assurances of safety. This included secondhand exposures because of lack of decontamination. MRL signalman B.J. McComb recalled a crew on site laying temporary track to haul damaged cars. McComb ran into them at their Frenchtown tool house. They were just coming in from working up there in their truck, he said, and their clothes stunk so bad, and that was probably 3 or 4 days after the spill. Geez, they all just reeked. The workers were not decontaminated. Shit, no, there was no such thing, McComb said. They'd go home and wear them fucking clothes. Leroy Strong worked for the Montana Department of Transportation. His first exposure came on April 11 while setting up roadblock signs at the Y. Strong's next and most serious exposure came about April 15, when he and a few other men were sent to the DOT section house outside Alberton to move heavy equipment. We got down to Petty Creek at 5 o'clock in the morning, and they escorted us in. It was a sheriff's deputy with a monitor. Even at Petty Creek, Strong said, I could smell the chlorine gas while we were waiting at the road. The DOT shop was on the west end of Alberton, about 2 miles from the site. While the men worked, Strong said, I noticed the smell started getting stronger and stronger, and I thought, this is not good. So I was trying to hurry up. We were in there probably 20 minutes at least, but when the smell started getting really, really strong, I didn't even pay any attention when the deputy left, but all of a sudden he was gone, and he's got the monitor. He's the first guy out of there. Anyway, everybody wanted to get out of there. It was powerful. It was like you hit the wall. You tried to breathe, and it was pretty bad. Your eyes and your breathing. I guess it was a spike. That's what I heard later anyway. And the wind might have changed directions too. It might have blown it right in on us. It didn't only have a chlorine smell. It had an almost metallic type smell. None of these workers were given protection or received instructions about the contingency of exposure. After the others left, Strong stayed to tie his load down with chains. It probably took me another 10 to 15 minutes, he said. By the time I got on the interstate, I could hardly breathe. It was taking your breath away, and it was burning. Later that day, Strong began coughing out phlegm and stuff, he said, and I knew I must have probably burned my lungs. Strong said many DOT men working roadblocks at Petty Creek and even 9 Mile complained of irritating chlorine odors. Larry Mickelson of the Montana DOT spent 8-hour graveyard shifts on the Petty Creek roadblock, a quarter-mile west of his home above Southside Road, over 4 miles from the spill. On April 14, the Mickelsons returned home. They had left their airtight house closed up, and there was no smell inside, but Larry said it continued to smell outside, sometimes strong. I couldn't get a full breath, he said. The lungs were tight. Some eye burning, irritation. When we came home, both the wife and I noticed that our skin sensitivity was real bad. One night while working the roadblock, he said, the chlorine got so bad outside that I had to turn the heater off because it was bringing so much of it into the cab. And they told us that if it got too strong, they would sound the sirens, and then we would put on our masks and evacuate. The roadblock workers were given a filter mask, but no monitor. We were told absolutely only to use it during evacuation. More worrisome, at nearby homes, including his own, residents had no masks. Despite the strong smell that night, there was no call to evacuate. Mickelson generally found that between midnight and 4 in the morning was when the smell was worst. You could see kind of like a smog in the air that night that it got real bad. On other nights, sometimes you could look back towards the spill area and there appeared to be a haze over there. The roadblock day shift reported similar strong smells. At home, Mickelson said, the wife noticed it that same night that it got so bad. She came right back in the house. There were apparently spikes coming out of those cars at night. Those roadblocks probably should have been at 9 Mile. The Mickelsons felt they had been sent home to live and work in a zone of ongoing exposure. Tom Wheeler of Alberton, DOT worker, was assigned roadblock duty at Petty Creek. On day shift, Wheeler received additional exposures. There were a couple of times they come and said they were getting a spike, and you should wear your respirator, he said. I would wear it more, probably more than the other ones, because I was having trouble with my breathing anyhow. Residents just to the east had no respirators and received no warnings. A half-mile east of the Petty Creek roadblock, Frenchtown Rural Fire Station 5 served as forward command post near the river. Shifts ran 7 to 7, with 15 people on day, 12 at night. Despite her initial chemical injury, Alberton volunteer firefighter Terry Fairbanks reported to duty on April 12 at Station 5. One source of new exposure came from the lack of decontamination at Station 5, despite that a wading pool with hoses was set up outside. It was a joke, she said. It was never used. Fairbanks described the Petty Creek Station as a sort of pit stop for myriad officials and crews going to and coming from the site. They'd come from the hot zone down to our station, they'd take their clothes off, their turnout gear, or whatever they had on, and just re-exposing us continuously. They would just dump them right there in the station. Fairbanks said decontamination complaints made to Incident Command were blown off, not taken seriously. Basically, she said, the first day I got a healthy dose of it, and then the 18 days I was at the station, it was just ongoing exposure. Pretty soon it was open up the bays and air everything out, because it was just like being right in Alberton again. Everyone she worked with seemed to have flu-like symptoms. Further exposure came from continuing releases of chlorine from the site on load-up days. There was always more in the air, she said, like a strong pool smell. We'd have chlorine moments. It became a joke with us. It affected people in various ways, where I'd have a headache or start coughing. We got monitors fairly late into the situation there at the station. Fairbanks felt forward command and the exclusion zone border should have been back at 9 Mile. The Station 5 crew wore street clothes, and Fairbanks washed hers every night because they stunk, she said. Frenchtown Command said we were safe, as if we were to go into our bathroom and disinfect it with bleach. But Fairbanks had likely become sensitized. Early on April 15, an ambulance responded to Station 5 when Fairbanks became ill from fresh exposures to chlorine. Frenchtown volunteer firefighter Linda Walsh succumbed to fresh exposure the day before Terry Fairbanks did. Walsh worked at Station 5 along with her husband, Pat. According to Linda Walsh's pulmonologist, Dr. William Beckemeyer, on the 14th, she noticed a different smell, which she describes as a pesticide-type smell, which caused her and her co-workers to get a headache, nausea, and vomiting, Beckemeyer wrote. The ER report said she smelled something sulfurous. Pat said Linda had to be taken to the ambulance and treated for exposure, as if she went into a hot zone without proper protective gear. Linda Walsh was taken to the ER with trouble breathing. where she was found to have asthma from the spill, a doctor later reported. Frenchtown volunteer firefighter Pam Roberts was offered a paying job to help staff Station 5. She worked a 12-hour day shift. I didn't notice any smell when I first pulled into there, she said. There was a lot of people there, and they were monitoring. Everything was open to the air, and my throat's getting scratchier. There were other people that had been there longer than me, and you would look at them, and their eyes were all red and stuff, and just looking awful, eyes watering and coughing. And the longer it went on, the more I felt bad. Mostly it was my throat. I kept coughing. And then my husband drove down there to see me on his way home from work, and he goes, "I cannot believe you stayed here all day." He could smell it, and it was really strong. I couldn't smell anything. Roberts had acclimated to the smell. Eventually, Roberts said, I said, "I don't feel so good." So they suggested I went to the emergency room because this other girl, Linda Walsh, they had taken her to the emergency room already. On the morning of April 15, an ambulance picked up Roberts, at least the third emergency response to a worker at Station 5 in less than 18 hours. There was no public report that Station 5 workers were getting ill from new exposures, which took place after the area east of Petty Creek was reopened for residents. Assistant Chief of the Alberton Volunteer Fire Department, James Claxton, worked day shifts at Station 5. Claxton visited Alberton for a town safety check and noticed his trailer just reeked of the odor, he said, of bleach and chlorine. At one point he drove a safety officer to forward ops at Natural Pier Bridge, beyond which protective gear was required. As he waited for the officer to return, he said, "I could feel it again. It was just like that night again. Breathing difficulties, headaches started kicking in. I went to try and find him. I need to get out of here and go back." Claxton believed that no residents should have been allowed back in the exclusion zone until the incident was over. Of Station 5, Scott Waldron claimed, "We evaluated the area. We maintained monitoring. They were responsible for monitoring. They had monitors. All of the hazmat teams were staged there. I mean, we had all the people monitoring we could. I don't believe that they were, quote, unquote, being re-exposed. I don't believe that for a minute. I think that we put them in there based on just no different than letting people, residents, go back in there. We had homeowners in there when we let them re-enter the area. We did it based on good scientific evidence. There was no exposure there." Chris Weiss recalled, "We felt it was safe there, although there were high concentrations very close to the site, but those didn't extend very far and were diluted by the time they got to Petty Creek." The logs reflected no discussion about the exposures of Fairbanks, Roberts, and Walsh, all of which triggered an ambulance response to Station 5. Some staff at Station 5 recalled no problems and seemed oblivious of others' concerns. But the experience of some had shown that long exposure to even low levels of chlorine could deaden the ability to smell it. Those that had symptoms were likely sensitized. Chris Weiss said chlorine gas continued to vent, often at lethal levels. "I mean, there was chlorine gas everywhere," he said, vaporizing in a freeze-thaw cycle. "You know, the air would be green in this bubble-like shape," he said, "and it would float, find its own equilibrium and float, either through camp or down the river or nearby, and then it would go away. The measured spike might only last a minute and then drop off, but that spike could be deadly." On occasion, chlorine could be smelled beyond the core hot zone, but Weiss didn't think levels were significant. "Outside the hot zone," he said, "there were only a couple occasions that I can recall where my monitor went off, and that would have been on I-90 right near the accident site. The IDLH alarm of 10 parts per million or greater. I got a couple of doses. You can't help but feel affected if you breathe something over a few parts per million of chlorine. You can't really breathe. It is strong." But Weiss felt prepared. "I would have immediately put my respirator on, absolutely. You could not have survived around that accident site very long without a respirator in your hand or hanging right around your neck if it wasn't on all the time." At forward ops, within 3/4 of a mile east of the site, there were a couple of times early in the response when a little puff of chlorine would come floating through camp, he said, but not enough to have the forward ops folks pull back. As it turned out, forward ops would indeed be evacuated. Further east, Weiss was aware of complaints at Station 5. They knew that there were unpredictable concentrations of chlorine floating by periodically, he said. "It doesn't surprise me that they may have smelled chlorine and or cressolate at that station." The spilled potassium cressolate was almost 5 miles downstream. They could have, he said. The weather patterns and the meteorology of that canyon is such that it would have been possible. Some of the light fraction components, such as the phenols, Weiss said, would have had some vapor pressure. Your nose is really sensitive to phenolic compounds, so it's conceivable that people that had a sensitive nose could have smelled it quite a ways away, miles away. For sensitized responders, Weiss said, another exposure could have triggered a hypersensitivity reaction. That would have been very consistent with acute chlorine exposure, days following an acute chlorine exposure. And if Weiss wasn't surprised that people at Station 5 may have smelled chlorine and or cressolate, residents living nearby or visiting the exclusion zone could have as well. Cracks appeared in the wall of reassurance. By the public logs and media reports, complaints of odors and symptoms barely registered. The exclusion zone was deemed safe to visit, but many visitors experienced the smell and felt symptoms and were openly distrustful of assurances of safety. What was the source of the Alberton smell? What did this mean for their homes, for their future health? Residents who returned and had reactions didn't understand what was happening to them. Chlorine sensitivity had seemingly caught health officials off guard, but Ellen Leahy said she heard the complaints. I would hear them at the daily evacuee meeting, she said, and that's where everybody would hear them. On April 15, Leahy made a note at the evacuee meeting of a, quote, Alberton smell. Leahy: at one meeting I stood up and said, I believe you. I don't know what you're smelling, but I have to tell you, if you're smelling something, I believe you. I heard from more than one complaint about lips tingling. I heard a complaint about, and more than one, a feeling like their breathing had been affected. Other complaints included feeling kind of nervous, those kinds of feelings, headache. Officials were just on the threshold of investigating whether some chemical other than chlorine was the source of the complaints. Next time on Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment, we conclude Chapter 17 as residents grow more vocal about complaints of chemical smells during visits to the Alberton area and the implications for their long-term health. Until then, this is Ron Scholl. Thanks for listening. Next time on Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment, more residents push back against assurances of safety, increasingly concerned about their long-term health and the chemical smells in the Alberton area during visits. Until then, this is Ron Scholl. Thanks for listening. This podcast is adapted from the book Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. Visit Amazon.com to see the 2-book series. To access support material in the book, such as maps, photos, illustrations, and video links, visit my Facebook page Gas, the true story, or watch my Gas playlist on my YouTube channel at RL Scholl.